The time is getting closer now for action. President Trump was elected on a platform to end the Russia-Ukraine war. He's been talking about it ever since then. After coming into power, he's continued to make statement after statement about what he's going to do and how he's going to get it done. But now it's just about time to actually start putting some action to his words. And there's going to be a showdown between things that Vladimir Putin is saying, what Trump is saying, and then what can actually happen as a result of that. And to try and make some sense out of at least some of the public statements that are being made by the various sides, we have Ambassador Chaz Freeman back with us today, former U.S. Ambassador, senior State Department and Defense Department official, and just and really one of the best minds in anything diplomacy these days in America. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back to the show.
I'm glad to be with you, Danny.
Listen, I think this is the first time we've had you on since Trump's actually been in office, and so we've had, talking about the previous occupant of the White House with Joe Biden for a long time. And now then here we go on round two for Trump. And boy, this is kind of a consequential issue right off the top here. What's going to happen with him in Russia because it has a lot to do with American economic security, financial security, national security, and obviously a lot of ramifications for Europeans itself, not the least of which is for Ukrainians. First of all, I want to show you something that Trump said here just a little bit ago today, actually. At first, he was talking about some things with China, but then he pivots with China to talk about how he wants some help with Russia.
I like President Xi very much. I've always liked him. We always had a very good relationship. Hopefully, China can help us stop the war with, in particular, Russia, Ukraine. They have a great deal of power over that situation. And we'll work with them. And I mentioned that during our phone conversation with President Xi. And hopefully we could work together and get that stopped. We'd like to see denuclearization. In fact, with President Putin prior to an election result, which was frankly ridiculous, we were talking about denuclearization of our two countries, and China would have come along. China has a much smaller right now nuclear armament than us, or field than us, but they're going to be catching it at some point over the next 4 or 5 years. And I will tell you that President Putin really liked the idea of cutting way back on nuclear. And I think the rest of the world, we would have gotten them to follow. And China would have come along too. China also liked it.
Okay, so I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about the Russia issue with getting Putin, trying to get Xi Jinping to help Trump with Putin. But I thought it was a little odd that he's talking about the denuclearization of the United States and Russia and how that Putin thought that was a great idea. I've never heard him talk about that. Have you heard anything about that?
No, this is entirely new. It's actually very encouraging because, of course, we have over the last administration and its predecessor, Mr. Trump himself, we have basically trashed the entire arms control effort, which made us more secure. It reduces the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. I think this is tied into the resolution of the Ukraine issue in the sense that if Ukraine were neutral, Russia would have far fewer fears about being attacked from the West, and it would not face the security challenges that it does. And it might then in fact, be willing to resume the process of mutual de-escalation of nuclear forces. I'm a little more dubious about China unless we can find a new basis for peaceful coexistence with China, because the administration is heavily staffed by people who are passionately anti-China. The Trump administration is starting out not just threatening tariffs and economic pressure on everybody in the world, but including China, with a purported 10% tariff on top of the 25% tariff that Mr. Trump put in when he's in his first term. So we're threatening Mexico, Canada, the European Union, the BRICS group, China, and I suppose this would apply to virtually anyone with whom we have a trade imbalance. So this is a strange way to start, but it's encouraging to hear him talk about addressing the issue of reducing the danger of nuclear war.
Well, certainly would agree with that. I think, I mean, I guess there would have to be some action behind it for any of these other folks to be going down that path, but certainly something I would also encourage. I want to back up to Monday, first of all, with Trump, because he gave some of his more, I guess, clearer statements on wanting to end the war in Ukraine and how he might go about doing that. Here's what he said on Monday.
How long do you think it would take to end that conflict? And
I have to speak to President Putin. We're going to have to find out. He can't be thrilled. He's not doing so well. I mean, he's grinding it out, but most people thought that war would have been over in about 1 week. And now you're into 3 years, right? So he can't be thrilled. It's not making him look very good. Zelensky wants to make a deal. I don't know if Putin does. He might not. I don't know. He should make a deal. I think he's destroying Russia.
So let's start with the end of that clip there. He thinks that Putin is destroying Russia. How do you see that?
I think that's a reflection of the mainstream media environment, which has been very propagandistic and entirely wrong in its predictions of how the war in Ukraine would unfold. And, you know, I think Mr. Putin has been very clear in his objectives from the beginning, and they don't have much to do with Ukraine, except as part of a broader problem of insecurity in Europe. So he's asked for a broad discussion of some sort of new security architecture for Europe that would relieve the threat to Russia while relieving any threat from Russia to the West. In that connection, he wants Ukraine restored to the neutrality in which it was born, not to become a platform for the stationing of American troops and weapons right on the Ukrainian border. And finally, he wants the rights of the Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine to be respected. Now, of course, there's been a lot, as Mr. Trump indicated, this is 3 years of warfare. It may be taking its toll on the Russian army, but the Russian army is not the one that invaded Ukraine 3 years ago. It's vastly more stronger, larger, better equipped. It has learned how to cope with the best weaponry that NATO and the United States could supply to Ukraine. I agree with him. The Ukrainians are very brave people. So are the Russians. They're cousins. And so if Mr. Trump can't come up with a formula to address Mr. Putin's concerns, I think the war is going to continue. And if he can address Mr. Putin's concerns, then we will see Ukraine, which is now really on the ropes. There's a lot of talk about clandestine discussions going on between Moscow and Kyiv already. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it would be sensible. Ukraine is running out of Ukrainians with which to prosecute this war.
I want to look at one of the aspects of what's being billed and actually proclaimed as part of Trump's strategy when that comes with his envoy, General Keith Kellogg, who's been put at the forefront. He has said that a couple of interesting things. One, that he wants to have this wrapped up, done in 100 days, so just a little over 3 months. And one of the first features of it is that he said he is seeking basically a freeze of the conflict on the current line of contact, a ceasefire. Now, we had Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister, address that issue not long ago, and he says that's not going to happen.
We cannot be satisfied with empty talk. So far, all we've heard is talk about the need to come up with some kind of truce. And it's not particularly hidden that this truce is needed in order to gain time to continue pumping weapons into Ukraine. A truce is a road to nowhere.
So is that true? Is it a road to nowhere? Or because other people might say, well, that's actually a necessary precondition to, but once you stop the fighting, then you can start to have dialogue. People don't have to die in the process or so. How do you see that playing out from the two different perspectives?
Well, I think both sides are basically thinking the same of each other. That is, if we had a ceasefire, this would allow us to rebuild Ukraine and in due course admit it to NATO, which the Russians will never permit. And on our side, we think, well, if there's a ceasefire, that will just allow the Russians to get ready to go back at war. I don't think either is true, actually, and I would remind everybody of the Korean War, in which the negotiations occurred while the fighting was still going on. Admittedly, the fighting was going on in a less volatile manner, less decisive manner than it had been earlier, but there was a lot of fighting going on, and the Chinese described this as da da tan tan, fight, fight, talk, talk. And eventually it did produce an armistice, which was supposed to be turned into a peace treaty, but never did. The Russians remember that. They don't want to have a DMZ in Ukraine dividing them from NATO. That just perpetuates the conflict, and it leaves a military confrontation, which nobody really wants. So I think Mr. Putin and Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister for Mr. Putin, is faithfully reflecting Mr. Putin's thinking. He wants a peace in Europe. He wants a reorganized security structure. He does not want a ceasefire, particularly when he has not completed the conquest of the 4 Russian-speaking oblasts that he has formally annexed, and which he occupies only in part. There's one of them, Lugansk, which is entirely in Russian hands, but the other 3 are divided between the retreating Ukrainians and the advancing Russians. So if you talk to the Russians, as I have on occasion, you find out they feel very passionately that they have spent a lot of blood and treasure to do what they've done, and namely to protect the Russian speakers in Ukraine and to lay the basis for a broader negotiation, and they're not going to yield. And so this is, if we are stuck on a ceasefire, that guarantees an impasse, not progress.
Well, does it guarantee an impasse, or does it just guarantee a continuation of the conflict moving westward?
That's what I mean. That's a negotiating impasse.
Oh, I see.
That means you cannot, if you have a problem with another country, you can solve it through negotiations if you're willing to be flexible and firm, or you can solve it on the ground. And basically, the Russians have not felt that there was any alternative to the use of force. This war began in February 2022 after the United States, under the Blinken and Biden administration, declared that it would not discuss the issues with Russia. It refused negotiations. And we know that from Stoltenberg and others that they understood very well that what Russia was after was the end of a threat from Ukraine in the form of Ukrainian neutralization. Ukraine as a buffer and as a bridge between Russia and the rest of Europe. That's what they wanted. But we wouldn't talk about it. And if we're not prepared to talk about that now, I think the fighting is going to go on.
Well, and that leads us to the next thing I want to discuss here, because we'll just look at what President Trump wants to do to try and get this to a negotiated settlement. It's a little unconventional, I think you can say, in the most charitable way, but he posted this on Truth Social yesterday, where he's talking about, first of all, that, there's a lot of good things about Russia. They helped. We were allies in World War II. They lost a lot of people in the process, and we need to stop this ridiculous war, et cetera. But then he gets to the end, and he says, "This would never have started if I were president. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, and it's always better to do it the easy way. Let's make a deal." So he's basically given an ultimatum to the Russian side, saying, "Hey, either you come alongside and do what I want, or we can do it the hard way," which he didn't define completely. But how do you think that this message is being received in Russia?
I think it's probably being ridiculed. The level of Russian trade with the United States is, something like $350 million a year. It's almost nothing. Tariffs aren't going to do a damn thing to put pressure on Russia. It's already under ferocious sanctions from the United States and the West, and it has reoriented itself toward China, India, West Asia, Africa, so the alternative would be to up the ante in terms of more weapons for the Ukrainians. But that isn't, weapons are not the Ukrainians' problem. It's, the fact they don't have the manpower to continue this war successfully against the Russians. So there's a lot of, this is, the important part of the Trump message, I think, is not the threat, which will be dismissed as insignificant, but the declaration that he really wants to get this war ended. I think Mr. Putin wants to get it ended too, but he has terms, and he's in a better position to enforce those terms than we are.
Well, there was actually, I actually have been reading some stuff just right before we came online from some of the Russian media, and there was some ridicule of it because they're looking at the spreadsheets like you and I are, and they see that there's a lot less leverage on the Trump side than there is on Putin's side. And then they say, we don't give into that kind of stuff anyway, never have. There was this from a member of the Russian Duma today where he's just saying, hey, listen, this just some kind of imitation of openness, frankness, and threats from Trump instead of serious positions that President Putin formulated in his congratulations on the day of his inauguration. Trump doesn't seem to know what to do, and threatening us with ultimatums, scaring us with tariffs is empty talk. And so then that kind of leads me to the next question. Then if I mean, again, just looking at the spreadsheet and looking at the force balance of power between the two sides, Trump can't threaten the Russian side because he's not going to send any American troops in there, though some that seem to want him to do so. We'll talk about that in a second. But he wants to get out. Trump wants to get out, but he doesn't want to get in deeper. And if he doesn't have that leverage over Putin and he's made this threat, we can do it the hard way or the easy way. What if Putin goes, okay, what's the hard way? And what is Trump going to do?
Well, I think we're in a very bad state. The Biden administration, which basically started this war and which doubled down on it in the effort to isolate and weaken Russia, which didn't happen, has left Mr. Trump with a real problem. But he created a problem for himself because he promised he would end the war in 24 hours. Now he's learning that isn't possible, and it's quite clear that he doesn't have yet a full understanding of the Russian position, what's possible with the Russians. And I think in that connection, he's right to say, as he did in the answer to the press question when he was sitting at his desk that you aired earlier, that he has to talk to Mr. Putin. And the fact that he's willing to do that is already a great advance because the Biden administration never did. Secretary of State Blinken never visited Moscow. He didn't meet even with Lavrov, except, for a brief 10-minute encounters at the margins of conferences. The Biden administration practiced no diplomacy. Mr. Trump wants to. Whether he has the knowledge, whether his team is up to that or not is another issue. But we're not as you said, we're not in a position to muscle the Russians on Ukraine. And it was a grave error to start to believe we ever could.
And so you talk about the other half of this equation here. You've mentioned a couple of times what Putin has said. Well, I'm going to show you something he said about a month ago about what he's looking for. So I like your commentary on, is this, some people are approaching negotiations, I'm going to ask for a lot more than I want so that I can pare back to here. Is this something like that? Or is Putin saying, no, really, this is what we're going to have?
What we need is not just a ceasefire. We need peace, a long-lasting peace.
We don't have any preconditions for talks. We are ready to engage in a conversation without preconditions. But there has to be a basis of something that we've agreed upon during the talks in Istanbul in late 2022, and based, of course, on the realities on the ground at this moment.
And I think what he says, the realities on the ground, I think he's referring back to not just the current line of contact, but on his June 14th of last year, his lines where he said all four of the oblast, all four of them, not just the part that they currently own here. So is that a question? Do you think that there's room for that Putin would negotiate not getting all four of those oblasts?
I can't say. I don't know, but I take him seriously in his statement of his objectives. he will make every effort to achieve those objectives. And those objectives begin with a redefinition of the security arrangements in Europe. Ukraine is merely a part of that. So if we have any illusions that this is about Ukraine rather than about a post-Cold War peace in Europe, we will be disillusioned. So I don't think the Russians necessarily approach negotiations as you do when you buy a rug in the bazaar, where you state an opening position that is completely unrealistic. I don't think that's the case here. I think we have to take him seriously. We have to be prepared to discuss with Mr. Zelensky and the establishment in Ukraine, what the best possible outcome would be realistically for them. I mean, our objective should be to save Ukraine from further erosion, further loss of territory, further loss of people, and to pave the way for it to become a bridge and a buffer between Russia and the rest of Europe. And in that connection, to join the EU, which is going to take a decade or more. Ukraine is not a democracy. It does not have a free press. It is the most corrupt country in Europe. There are other contestants, but Ukraine wins that contest hands down. It has terrible relations with many of its neighbors, not just Russia. I mean, there's now an agreement, a contretemps between Poland and Ukraine over the 150,000 or so Poles that Ukrainian nationalists murdered during World War II, at the eve of World War II. There's the issue of 250,000 Jews being murdered by those very same people who are now revered as the founders of modern Ukraine. And when the Russians talk about denazification, what they're talking about is a recognition that Stepan Bandera and company, who were pro-Nazi, organized a Ukrainian army to support the Wehrmacht in World War II, and are viscerally anti-Russian. And the Russian speakers in Ukraine have got to be secured. And Mr. Putin tried very hard to do that with a negotiation, which actually resulted in 2 Minsk Accords. It was not Russia that repudiated those accords, which would have left those 4 oblasts, or the 2 that were contested then, as part of Ukraine. It was the Ukrainians and the sponsors of those negotiations, the French and Germans, who later admitted that the only reason they had sponsored the Minsk Accords was to gain time for NATO to arm Ukraine so that it could take back the rebel areas with force.
You mentioned really both what the other parties of this. It's not just Trump and Putin, but it's also Ukraine and it's also Europe, and those both have a role to play here too. So I want to look at a little bit of kind of where they are on this, and I wonder if we can kind of start to put together a comprehensive picture of just how complicated and difficult this is going to be. A lot of it's self-inflicted wounds, as Ala will claim. But here, first of all, is Zelensky. He was interviewed. This is published anyway, earlier today by Bloomberg News from Zelensky when he was in the Davos Economic Forum. And he was asked specifically about an article that was in the paper a couple of days ago that said that he had asked for 200,000 French and German peacekeepers, French and British peacekeepers to oversee any kind of negotiated settlement. And he had an interesting take on what he actually meant with those peacekeepers.
I heard that some allies said that, yes, but it's okay, we can be in the center of some city, and then no, we don't need such contingents.
You want them at the front line?
Yes, with our people, of course. Yes, because this means security, and that's it. So, but it can't be. It can't be without the United States. I will explain you why. Even if some European friends think that it can be, no, it will not be. First of all, nobody will risk without United States. The second, that what can divide NATO, divide EU and USA. That is a goal and dream of Putin, to divide this unity. And that can be, if you only Europeans will be, first of all, they don't have some hundreds of thousands. Be honest. No, they don't have. They don't have such troops. You know that our army is more than 800,000.
It's very big by the standards.
Second, France.
Yes.
200, a little bit more, 200, and all our partners are there less and less and less.
So I thought that's a little low. Let's just break that down. First of all, what is the prospect that you think that any kind of negotiated settlement will end with Russia agreeing to have Western peacekeepers involved on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, he's not really talking about peacekeepers. He's talking about co-combatants. You know, that isn't going to work. The Russians were willing to go to war to ensure that Ukraine was neutral and that NATO didn't have 100,000, 200,000 troops in Ukraine. Zelensky's absolutely right, by the way. There aren't 200,000 troops. Frankly, we don't have them any more than the Europeans do. You know, we are overextended militarily. Europeans are hedging against Mr. Trump's threats to leave NATO or not come to their aid against an aggressive Russia. They're building greater defense budgets, but I don't see any way that they can match the Russians on the ground in Ukraine, or would want to. So this is wishful thinking. And one can understand why Mr. Zelensky would very much like to have others serve as cannon fodder in the war with Russia. His naming his point about 800,000 troops, I don't know whether that's correct or not in terms of the current order of battle in Ukraine. I rather suspect it isn't. But it does make a point, and that is, on the eve of this war, Ukraine had an army roughly that size. And that army was deploying to the east to take Donetsk and Lugansk back from the Russian-speaking rebels there. That was a factor in the start of this war. So I don't think, I can't imagine the Russians accepting anything like that. It's probably a guarantee of escalation to the nuclear level.
Well, yeah, because he actually made an additional statement there that he hadn't made before, that I think it should not only be European troops, but it should also he said it must include American troops. And I frankly don't see any prospect at all that Trump would ever agree to that, even if the numbers could be found. And you're correct in that our total active army is less than 500,000. I think it's like 479,000 currently, which is a shock to many Americans that our army is that low when you realize that Russia has somewhere around 700,000 just inside of Ukraine itself. So we just don't have those kind of troops. And why would we ever send them there?
Well, I don't think this is a question of Mr. Trump. Even Joe Biden, with all of his willingness to tolerate wars in Ukraine, genocide in the Middle East, threats against China over Taiwan, even he would not have agreed to send American troops. Why? Because the Russians have not escalated to the level they could. And by the way, I don't know what would happen. I mean, I'm sure U.S. forces are very able, well-trained, well-equipped, and so forth. But the Russians are a real tough bunch, and they have learned a great deal from this war in Ukraine. Do we have the drone forces, for example, to match theirs? Ukraine has been very ingenious. Incidentally, Ukraine's drones are built with Chinese parts, which puts the lie to the Biden administration's line that China was somehow acting pro-Russian. China was neutral. I think Mr. Trump has a good idea when he tries to reach out to Xi Jinping and the Chinese to help put an end to this war. But I would remind everybody that the Chinese at the very outset of the war put forward a statement of 12 principles they thought should be followed in ending it. And they have not wavered from that. They have their own ideas. Mr. Trump might actually learn something from some of those ideas. The Chinese, I think, want an end to this war. It doesn't do them any good at all. So Mr. Trump's right to seek partners to end the war. He might also try that with India, which has a very good relationship with Moscow as well. At least he's thinking. He's trying to find an opening. He wants to make a deal. The question
he does, but interestingly enough, and discouragingly, I guess, there are those in Europe that don't seem to want that, or that just can't seem to let go of the current conflict. Here earlier today was Mark Rutte was speaking at a conference. I think they're still in Davos. That was run by an American CNN reporter, and he was asking things about what can they do with this current situation here, with Trump coming in and talking about a negotiated settlement, and he makes some strange observations. As you're going to listen to this, I'll give you a prep. He's going to make a comment early in this clip here where he says, okay, sure, the line is moving to the west right now. Ukraine is in retreat, as you said earlier in this episode. He's going to acknowledge that, and then he's going to say, but that's for 3 different reasons. Tell me if you agree with his 3 reasons for why Ukraine is losing.
We really have to step up and not scale back the support for Ukraine. We have to change the trajectory of the war which is ongoing. And so far, as we know, the front line is moving in the wrong direction, is going eastwards. And this is for 3 reasons. One, because of Ukraine. We cannot allow in the 21st century that one country invades another country and tries to colonize it. We are beyond those days, past those days, so that's one. Secondly, because we know it is, yes, Ukraine, but it is also about how China and North Korea and Iran and Russia are all working together. And this is basically testimony to the fact that this is not only a European conflict, it is a geopolitical issue.
Now, let's take a look at a number of those things. Let's look at the premise, first of all. This is the whole thing being talked here, is that Trump is now on the eve of starting negotiations to end the war. Why then would NATO want to say, we got to do everything we can to change the dynamics so that Ukraine is stronger, when 3 years of history have done nothing but decimate Ukraine?
Well, this is in fact very consonant with the Ukrainian position, which the deputy prime minister announced the other day. And that is Ukraine. He said Ukraine's ready for negotiations. It wants negotiations, but it needs to be further strengthened in order to enter those negotiations. So that's basically Rutte is echoing that. But there are 2 other comments that he made that are frankly invite ridicule. He said this is not an era in which people can colonize other countries or and so forth. What's going on in Palestine, does he suppose? What's going on with Lebanon, Syria, Gaza? The West is on the side of the colonizers there, not against them. And the notion that somehow or other the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans are cooperating with each other against American dominance of the world just for the hell of it is ridiculous. We've basically pushed them in that together. We have maximum pressure on all of them. We are an economic war with China. We're a technological war with China. We have very strong sanctions against Russia. We have maximum pressure on North Korea and on Iran. And we are colluding with Israel in a threat to attack Iran. So, they come together. It's a defensive move. It's not an instance of aggression. And I don't think that it is correct at all that the Chinese weigh what they should do about Taiwan in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, or the Iranians weigh what's happening in West Asia in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, or the North Koreans who've been basically bottled up behind the DMZ for 70 years, somehow think that Ukraine is anything but a wonderful training ground for their troops who are gaining combat experience that they hadn't had for 70 years. And like the Russians, are likely to emerge from that much more confident and stronger. So I think
doesn't it diminish NATO's credibility when all of these would-be opponents see them just completely living in an unrealistic frame of work, and that they think that even though they have demonstrable catastrophic failure for 3 straight years of trying everything in the world to reverse this, are still talking on the eve of the end of the war like they're going to strengthen Ukraine. And you said just before we came on the air here that this is actually not even an issue about giving them weapons. There's nobody to use them on the other side. And actually, here's what Secretary of State Rubio said during his confirmation hearing.
The problem that Ukraine is facing is not that they're running out of money, it's that they're running out of Ukrainians. There's a size differential here that's important. Now, what Vladimir Putin has done is unacceptable. There's no doubt about it, but this war has to end. And I think it should be the official policy of the United States that we want to see it end. Now, what that master plan looks like it's going to be hard work. This is not going to be an easy endeavor, but it's going to require bold diplomacy. And my hope is that it could begin with some ceasefire. And in order to achieve objectives like the one that needs to occur in Ukraine, it is important for everyone to be realistic. There will have to be concessions made by the Russian Federation, but also by the Ukrainians, and the United States has lent itself there. It's also important that there be some balance on both sides. In essence, it will be difficult to achieve this objective of a ceasefire and ultimately a peace settlement unless both sides have leverage.
That's a very sensible statement. And the essence of it is that we're all going to have to compromise. And we're all going to have to give the other side face. To the extent we can. But you cannot ignore the fact that something over 1 million men and women have died in this war. We don't know how many. And you can't ignore the fact that the Russian speakers in Ukraine were severely persecuted. 15,000 or so of them were killed in the civil war that broke out after Ukraine underwent its American-sponsored coup d'etat in 2014, and passed laws banning the use of Russian for official purposes in Ukraine. These are serious issues. You asked earlier about how the negotiations would proceed. There are multiple parties here. Certainly, the issue of where the Ukrainian border with Russia is and how the Russian speakers in Ukraine are protected are related issues. The issue of whether the Russian speakers in Ukraine have rights is of concern to Hungarians. There are 150,000 Hungarian speakers in Ukraine who've also been deprived of their right to use the language. There's a lesser number of Romanian speakers. There are Polish speakers, and there are other minorities. And this is going to have to be addressed in the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe context. The rules in Europe preclude the sort of discrimination that Ukraine has practiced. And the Russians, having signed off on Minsk and letting Russian-speaking areas remain part of Ukraine, and then seeing that subverted, are not going to buy a pig in a poke. If you get into the question of the broader security system in Europe, which we have to do, it's not just a question of Ukraine declaring neutrality and no intention to join NATO. You have to involve the major European powers, Germany, France, Italy, perhaps others, and NATO and the United States with the Russians. And so these are very complicated issues. And the notion, I disagree with Secretary of State Rubio, that you have to have a ceasefire in order to get talking, because as I said, that's not going to happen. And basically you get a ceasefire as a result of an agreement on basic principles, like the ones that the Chinese put forward. But we're a long way from that. We're still seeing everybody posture, somehow or other, if you did a decision tree, this is, you put a box in there that says a miracle happens here. Well, there's no miracle going to happen.
It's an empty box at the moment, and it's made more difficult. That I showed you that comment from Mark Rutte a minute ago. In that same conversation, he actually turns things around and says that they tried to negotiate in good faith in the past at the Minsk agreements, but it was the Russians that violated that and refused to do anything about it. So he's even saying, we can't go back to anything like that. But I'm just thinking, Mr. Ambassador, looking back on that, can you imagine if that was actually implemented back in the 2015 or any time before 2022? All these million people that you just talked about would still be alive.
Agree. There was a demand for implementation of Minsk. There was a demand for a discussion of European security architecture. And there was a demand for Ukraine to return to neutrality as part of the process. There was the model of the Austrian State Treaty of 1955, which established a neutral, democratic, prosperous Austria with guaranteed rights for minorities. That remains a model for Ukraine. But that Ukraine is going to be a rump Ukraine because of Ukrainian actions, including the trashing of the Minsk agreements, including the bombardment of the Russian-speaking areas, and including some pogroms against Russian speakers in places which aren't even in contention, like Odessa.
Odessa, yeah.
If war goes on long enough, Odessa will be in contention. And Ukraine risks losing its access to the Black Sea.
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to ask you as we close out this particular portion of the conversation here. If Trump tries to stick to these things that he's talking about doing so far, which is going down a path of seeking a ceasefire, trying to have some sort of a ultimatum given to the Russians, and if Putin just says, "Yeah, I'm not going to give in to that," and just keeps going, what is Trump going to do next?
Well, I hope he will have his conversation with Mr. Putin and his conversation with Xi Jinping, and that he will change course. He's nothing if not flexible and unpredictable. So I don't think he needs to be wedded to a strategy that will fail. I think he will look for one that can succeed, and we should all support that effort. He should have our encouragement for that, because this war, as Rubio said, has to end. It can't go on. And the notion that the Biden administration peddled that this war somehow was a great thing for Allied unity in NATO is belied by the fact that a number of NATO allies are very clearly at odds with this policy and recognize that Europe can't be at peace. It can't be stable unless there's an agreed relationship between Europeans, including Russians, and other Europeans. And if the United States is against that, then we are basically an enemy of peace, and the result will be the prolongation of the war. And Europe has a habit of starting world wars when it gets divided. This is not a trivial thing, even if you don't consider the nuclear dimension, which is there.
Right. Yeah. Well, certainly we do. I was a big advocate, because at least with Trump coming in, as you said several times in this episode, there's a shot at peace. There is talk about negotiations. He is ready to directly discuss things with Russia at both the presidential level as well as the senior leader level. So we're all about that. I guess I just hope that he gets enough advisors at the top that can tell him, battlefield math still works. Doesn't matter about whether anyone's opinion on this or that issue is. And if Trump tries to go down the wrong path, or a path that's unsustainable, Russia can simply continue on with its offensive until it achieves its objectives militarily on the ground, and it will not be good for anything else for that.
It's encouraging that Mr. Trump wants to engage in diplomacy, which the Biden administration did not. But it is a fact that you cannot regain at the negotiating table what you have decisively lost on the battlefield. And that is Mr. Putin's point of view. He's correct. Whatever happens is going to have to reflect the realities on the battlefield. I would hope that he would be willing to compromise. I think it's asking a bit much to have the Ukrainians abandon those parts of eastern and southern Ukraine that the Russians have yet to take. And I don't know whether how many Russian speakers there were there. There are 2.5, 3 million Ukrainian Russian speakers who've taken refuge and asylum in Russia. It wasn't just Ukrainians fleeing to the west from the Russians. It was Russian-speaking Ukrainians fleeing from Ukrainians and going to Russia. And this needs to get settled. It's not going to be easy.
Yeah, nothing is ever easy here, but at least, like you said, we have a chance. In the amount of time we have left here, I want to shift to a different battlefield, and that's down in the Middle East. I think since we haven't had you back on since the ceasefire has gone into effect in between Israel and Hamas. And one of the things that I found really, it didn't shock me. It was a little bit surprising, but the Wall Street Journal admitted that Hamas is effectively back in control in Gaza. And it turns out, and actually Secretary Blinken about a week or so ago admitted that just before the transition of power, he admitted that actually Hamas had almost completely reconstituted itself, even though, and Gary always shows these just breathtaking devastation scenes in the Gaza Strip, which is the whole category, sections of it have just been literally turned to dust and rubble. And yet, despite all that firepower, Hamas has still managed to rebuild its strength, no matter how many people have been killed. How do you view the situation right now with this ceasefire, and where do you think it goes from here?
Well, Hamas has actually gained a huge recruiting advantage because of the cruelty of the Israelis. The scene that you just put on of the hostage exchange and a show of force by Hamas really has two notable elements to it. One was that the hostages were very healthy. They appear to have been well taken care of, unlike the Palestinian hostages that Israel holds, who've been subjected to forced rape and starvation, torture, and the like. The three women who came out of that Hamas vehicle and transferred to the Red Cross were in good shape. So that is interesting. But Hamas chose the moment to show that it is still very much a fighting force and in control. And that is remarkable. I don't know how many of those young men with weapons were original combatants in Hamas and how many are newly trained people. But, one thing that this hostage exchange, it isn't really a ceasefire. It's a halt in the genocide, or a pause in the genocide for an expedient exchange of hostages, Palestinian hostages for Israeli hostages. One thing this shows is that the only way you get hostages out is through negotiation. 15, 16 months of warfare have not liberated more than one or two people from captivity. No, not liberated any Palestinians, but it didn't liberate more than a handful of Israelis. In fact, some of the Israeli hostages died because they were bombed by Israel, right, or Israeli troops were approaching with lethal weaponry to attack their captors. So negotiations work, military force doesn't work. And the more you pound the Palestinians, the more determined they are to stand their ground to fight back. And you can't end terrorism by conducting your own terror campaign.
Now, many in the Israeli media and a number of different officials have actually come on to say, listen, this is it's not a ceasefire so much as it is a pause to get the hostages back, because as soon as we do, we're going to go back on the offensive. And I may be mistaken, but I think it was even Netanyahu that said our objective is still to destroy Hamas. So once this is resolved, we're still going to get that done before we get to any kind of an end of conflict situation. How realistic is that for Israel?
Well, Mr. Netanyahu has been very open. He says he had assurances from the Biden administration and from the incoming Trump administration that he could start the war at will any time after the hostages were exchanged. So Bezalel Smotrich, who's still in his cabinet, is very open about this. We have to complete the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, throw everybody out. Mr. Trump's envoy, who gave to Netanyahu some tough love, and finally used some leverage on him to produce a hostage deal, which Biden never did. Biden claimed he was working 24 hours a day to get the hostages out. But in fact, he was working 24 hours a day to keep the fighting going. And he showed that with his endless supply of weaponry. And the destruction of Gaza continued. So I think, we're in a respite of a brief period, a pause between war of annihilation that the Israelis fully intend to resume. And I would note finally that while they have laid off Gaza for a little while, they've turned all their fury to the West Bank. The Israeli armed forces are now fully in cahoots with Israeli settlers, burning and smashing Palestinian homes and cars and driving people from their homes in an effort to accelerate the ethnic cleansing on the West Bank. So this hasn't really changed anything. And the key issue, which everybody dances around, is Palestinian self-determination. This is why it is absurd to imagine that the United States and Israel can determine who will govern Gaza or who will govern the West Bank. This is a thing that, Palestinians are entitled to self-determination as much as Israelis, even if Elise Stefanik, the Trump nominee for UN ambassador to the United Nations, does not agree that the Palestinians have any right of self-determination and says she's determined to end the anti-Semitic rot at the UN. But what she's going to find out is that there's almost no UN member who doesn't agree that there's genocide going on. This is highly unfair, that the United States has disgraced itself by its association with genocide. I don't think she's going to have a very fun time at the UN.
And do you aware to what extent the incoming Trump administration, whether it's Trump himself or any of his senior officials, are going to be able to have the freedom of action to do anything different than the Biden administration did in terms of bringing the conflict to a close and having even the possibility of independence and freedom for the Palestinian people? Is that even possible?
I don't think that's the focus of the Trump administration any more than it was the Biden administration. They're focused on helping Israel establish itself, they believe, securely. I don't think there can be any security for Israel as long as it is conducting genocidal attacks and cruelties to its captive Arab populations. Of course, it's trying to push out the Arab populations. I don't think that's going to succeed either. So I think poor people in Palestine who are returning to their homes or where their homes were, because as you said, there's nothing but dust there now, are, have a respite, but that's all it is. This whole thing's going to resume, and I believe it will resume with American support, which I find absolutely disgusting and disgraceful.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to say. If the pause ends, then that means that the Trump administration would then have to just restart what the Biden administration was doing, which is a literal nonstop ferrying of ammunition and weapons into Israel to continue on with this indefinitely. But as we can see, it's now graphically proven everything that Israel has done for 16 months militarily has been an absolute abject failure in terms of ending the conflict. So resuming that, how does anybody expect a different outcome?
Well, obviously, some people in the Trump administration disagree with you about that, because one of Mr. Trump's first acts, he invited settlers to his inaugural event. He has lifted the sanctions on the settlers who were guilty of genocidal acts. And he has lifted the restrictions on any kind of weaponry for Israel. So it's pretty clear that where he stands, and it is not in concert with the world, which the world has had enough of this stuff. We apparently have
But is
not.
there, you say that the world has had enough of this stuff, but is there any prospect that whether individual nations or groups of nations could ever take any action and say, for example, maybe it's too late for the Gaza Strip per se, but what about the West Bank? Is there anybody who's ever going to stand up and say, this is not right, we're going to do something about it? Or is it like everyone will do nothing as long as the United States does nothing?
Well, to date, the only country that has really taken forceful action against the genocide is Yemen, the Houthis, who enforced a blockade in the Red Sea, the first successful land-based sea blockade against ships going to and from Israel or resupplying the Israeli armed forces. And by the way, our effort to stop that was also an abject failure. We did not succeed. With all of our naval might, we did not succeed in stopping that. And we were not even able to stop the Houthis developing missiles that could strike Israel and penetrate Israeli defenses. The Iranians talked a good game, but when push came to shove, they were very restrained in their actions against Israel. They now, on January 17, just 3 days before the inauguration, they signed a comprehensive partnership with the Russians, which has a military component, but is primarily economic, cultural, and so forth, and financial. And they are strengthening their relations with the Russians. But I think the Iranians, like Mr. Trump says, America first. I agree with that. The Iranians say Iran first. And while they are concerned about the Palestine issue, we're concerned about the Palestine issue from a different direction, about Israel. They don't have the capacity to do very much, and they haven't. And our European fellow members of the collective West, who we've included Israel in that collective West, even though they've departed completely from the values that we espouse, and their actions are destroying international law. And it's not just in Gaza, it's also on the West Bank, as this slide illustrates. This isn't over, and we are not apparently prepared to stop it, which we could do. It's been obvious we could stop this in a moment by halting the supply of weaponry and finance to Israel. Israel, by the way, has just been downgraded by various rating agencies. Its debt is now going to cost it a lot more money if it can get loans. Its economy basically is wrecked. A huge number of Israelis have emigrated. There are many still displaced within Israel. And there's a lot of wishful thinking in Israel still. But there are many people there who seem to have come to the realization that they have not won this effort to suppress the Palestinians. In some ways, they may have strengthened the resistance against that.
Well, it's lamentable, just really anguishing, much more than lamentable, especially when Gary shows those images there, and then now that seems to be spreading into the West Bank. So, unfortunately, evidence confirms that you're right, that this is not over, and there's a long way to go, and it's kind of looks bleak, and it's hard to see the good picture here. At least in the Russia-Ukraine, there's some positive signs on the horizon. I would sure like to find some here. Do you see any positive signs that I have missed in terms of the Palestinian issue and Israel?
I really don't. I think Israelis are suffering. I'm afraid they will suffer even more. Their suffering doesn't even begin to compare, of course, with what the Palestinians have been through and continue to endure. I don't know what the future of that region is now. I don't think you can survive indefinitely with no human relationship with your neighbors other than pointing a weapon at them. That just doesn't work.
No, it doesn't. You know what? This can't go on indefinitely. I mean, this is not like the U.S. in Afghanistan, where we could literally go 2 decades of low level and just keep on supporting stuff. I mean, even the Israeli side, I mean, they're suffering a lot economically, and their military is suffering a lot because percentage-wise, it's substantially bigger than what we had in Afghanistan. And there's lots of people not willing to go back and serve on the reserve forces. I think that was part of the reason why they had to go to a ceasefire in both Hezbollah and Lebanon, as well as the Gaza Strip for now. But do you think they can sustain that?
Well, they're trying to hang on in Lebanon for an extra 30 days beyond the agreed ceasefire, which they have violated repeatedly. So clearly they're under stress. And that stress, I'd say, there are probably less than 500 Israeli soldiers who've been killed during this entire period. But there are probably 40,000 who've been seriously wounded and who in any other war would have been dead. They're able to medevac people a few miles to Israeli hospitals. But these people are, if they're not suffering from crippling disabilities, which many of them are, have mental problems. And we have what they did or what they observed in Gaza has created an enormous wave of PTSD. So you're right, the Israeli army is in real trouble. It's just lost its leadership. They were against Netanyahu. They didn't see any point in continuing this fruitless effort to destroy Hamas. What Netanyahu means by Hamas is any Palestinian resistance to subjugation. And if it weren't Hamas, it would be someone else. And we're reminded now in the hostage trading that's to come that some hostages are held by other Palestinian resistance groups. It's not all Hamas. In some way, it needs to be found for self-determination for the Palestinians in a way that does not allow the incredible, entirely understandable hatred that the events of the past 70-some years have created to continue to ripple forward in the form of mass murder and massacres and atrocities, torture, and the like.
Yeah. I just hope that somehow a way can be found that I don't know, Trump gets somebody on his staff that can help him see some of these things, because I think that in this reflexive desire of so many in the United States, and some I've engaged with here just recently, they think that it's supporting Israel to just give a blank check to everything they want. But I argue that the best thing we can do for Israel is to tear up that blank check and to start changing things, because this is harming them. Not as much as the Palestinian people are being harmed, but it's a lose-lose deal. The more we go on, the worse it's going to be for Israel, and nobody gets peace until both sides get peace.
Absolutely correct. And it is not the act of a friend to give a drunk money to buy more liquor. And the Israelis are drunk on their own power, and they need to be cut off the dole. They are living on an American dole. That has to stop.
It does, and we certainly hope that it does. But for now, I mean, it is, we're unintimidated and uncompromised to bring the truth. And even when it's ugly stuff like this, people have a right and deserve to know what the truth is, and not just a slanted one. So we're, as always, very, very grateful for you coming on today and providing such clarity onto what's really going on in both of these issues on the table here today. So thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador.
Keep up the good work, and try to find a happier topic if you can.
Will do. Maybe one day this will be a happy topic. We'll have to just keep our hopes on in that, and keep our prayers going too. Thank you very much for joining us today, though. Like I said, we're going to give you the truth, whatever it is, because you deserve to know. So appreciate you being here with us today. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't, and we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.